A turquoise ink by 3 Oysters, Gyeoul Haneul.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This isn't a usable color for me, but only... Sorry, this... you see the trouble I'm having reading some of this. This isn't a usable color for me as a primary color, but it's not useless. It does work out as a second color to add into notes without being too detracting from them in any kind of way. I do hope that this all really is showing up on camera, as this is a very pale turquoise. I imagine you have to be really love turquoise inks to truly appreciate this ink fully. It certainly is challenging on my eyes for a full page, as you're hearing a little bit, when I'm reading over what is written with this in front of me. But again, usable as a secondary color for me, if I have to, but nowhere near the colors that I'm used to. It's too light for my old eyes.
The pen for today is a Visconti Medici. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a readable tone here on the page. And I actually think it's easier to see when it's dried than when it's wet. Sometimes when it's wet, it feels like it's almost going down as an invisible color. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread, and yes, it does shade, and you can tell that it shades because the areas that it's shading are easy to read, like the end of laugh on the first line, if you can find it. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. There is no feather. There is no spread. There is a little bit of shading. Again, I can actually read what's here. It's not the end of the world. It's just that in a whole page, it is a little straining on the eyes. The shading is coming through very nicely. You see it in While the Goblin Drivers whooped and cracked. I can read it. I just don't want to read a whole page of it. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium and the extra fine, with no feather, with no spread. It does shade, and in its lighter tones, it really almost looks like it's fading away. And you see it on and in the third line, packages in the third line, broken in the fourth line. Kind of unfortunate, really. Looking at the back of the page, huge shock as there's no ghosting and nothing bled through to the other side.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feather, with no spread, with almost nothing for shading. It's really a very flat tone here the entire time. Readable, once again. But I do think if you're outside in bright light, this is going to be very hard to be able to read back. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feather, with no spread, with a little bit of shading that's going on. The shading does draw your attention to the fact that there's writing on the page, causing you to concentrate in order to read it. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium, the same tone as on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering and no spread. It does kind of shade some. You see it a little bit in those on the first line. Excellent on the first line, shows quite a bit of the shading. So it's definitely there. It's the darker areas that really matter because they help you decipher what's on the page. Again, it's just too light for my old eyes. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it's changed the tone of this green. It's just as light, but it's gotten to be a little bit more minty as a green. Now, there's no feathering and there is no spread. There's no shading that's going on here. I kind of like the tone that I'm seeing on the paper a little bit better, or the color a little bit better, but I'm not really like a fan of how light it is. I will say that this lighter green, even with this yellow background though, or yellowish background, is much easier for me to read. This paper, at least, it's not always going to work out that way. And take a look at the end to see what I'm talking about. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairefontaine, just obviously a green leaning instead of blue leaning as it was before, with no feather, with no spread, with no shading, with no chance of me buying a bottle. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as it was in the medium, just as dark as it was on the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread, still better looking as a green, that kind of a minty green that's going on here, opposed to the pale blue. The shading, there actually is a couple of spots of shading going on. You see it in Prisoners on the first line, and you see it in Hands on the third line, couple words on the fourth line. This still just wouldn't be my preference. Looking at the back of the page, really surprising everybody with no ghosting and no bleeding.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with the same amount of shading that the Clairefontaine had. I'm going to say that the quad rule that's going on here definitely makes this much harder to see because of how light it is. Often, with a very dark ink, the quad rule can almost fade into the background a little bit. I can sometimes look past it. With this, you see the quad rule as clearly as you do the writing. Not a good thing. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the extra fine, same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading going on, and you see it, especially in the first line. It does pretty good in individual words, shading in and out of its lighter and even lighter tones. I don't want to say darker so much, because even the darker tones are kind of light. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as we had with the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with better shading than we had on the Clairefontaine, better shading than we had in the medium. Truly, this is some of the best shading that we've gotten from this ink. Not to say that it is great. turquoise should be able to shade much better than we're getting right here, making it a little bit disappointing. Can you tell I'm not a fan of this ink? Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Havasu Turquoise. Here is Noodler's House Divided. Here is Organic Studios Nickel Teal. Here is Thornton's Turquoise. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter and more pale and flatter and less interesting than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade from a very light turquoise to a very, very light turquoise. You can tell it's there. It really looks like you left your notes out in the sun for about a week and really got a sun-bleached whatever was left on the page. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Not a surprise at all in what's going on there. No feathering, no spread. It is shading. I think it's shading much better than it did with the extra fine. Not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it definitely is doing it. You see it in trouble on the second line. Find that word. It's the third one from the left. I'm going to help you out. It's a little bit before halfway through. Through being the next word. There is some shading going on. It's not horrible to see. It's a me thing. I know there's people that love this tone, and I'm very happy for them. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was. Yep, just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Slightly seeing some of the greenish tone coming through here. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading. I think it shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You know, here I think what I'm seeing is one of the best of the tones for this paper. So use a stub if you're going to use this on this paper. But if you turned in your work with this ink to me, I'm going to knock you down 5 points. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Diamine Honey Burst. Here is a purple ink by Birmingham Pen Company, Phipps Conservatory Verbenham. Here is a black ink by Sailor Gentle Black. Here is a red ink by Diamine Oxblood. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is more or less the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, and we do get feathering, a whole lot of it, and a lot of spread, and the two of them combined with the light tone make this something I absolutely would not want to deal with at all. We get no shading, which I guess is a good thing. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the extra fine. We get no feathering. Yeah, it's just that it's light and it's hard to see. There's definitely feathering going on, and there's definitely spread going on. But again, the fact that it's so light that perhaps the feathering and the spread work to its advantage in this case, because I just can't see using a ton of this, but you can see what's there. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the medium. We get feathering, we get spread, we don't get any kind of shading, but we can kind of read what's there, thankfully for the much thicker lines. Looking at the back of the page, you see the ink got very deep into the paper, but never came through touching the page underneath. You could, I guess, use it, but I don't think you could take notes on both sides.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Its tone is usable from a medium flow pen, but even then, it's a little light for you, or for me, and makes me want to press harder on the page in a vain effort to get more ink to darken it up. So that's why I feel the best way to go here is from a very wet, fine, or an absolutely gusher of a medium.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.